Columbia University, spring convocation. The camera panned slowly across a room full of proud parents blinking back tears, their children standing in line dressed in robes, holding degrees they fought to earn. And then came the keynote speaker, Zohran Mamdani. Polished, passionate, poised, a progressive champion, a rising star in New York politics, the son of immigrants. And as he introduced himself, a black man raised between continents shaped by struggle. The crowd applauded. Professors smiled. Students cheered. One young woman in the front row wept. She was black, first generation, and just heard her pain, her identity spoken from the stage like it finally mattered. That speech went viral. TikTok, MSNBC, the New York Times, all hailed him as a new voice of racial justice. But 2 rows behind her, someone else stopped clapping. His name was Jerome Baptiste. And in that moment his stomach turned, because he knew something no one else in that room did. Zohran Mamdani was not black, not by heritage, not by upbringing, not by any stretch of the definition the rest of them had to live by. His skin was fair, his parents were Indian. His childhood was spent in elite schools between New York and Mumbai. But he had marked one box on one form years ago, black or African American, and no one ever checked. The scholarships came, the endorsements followed, and now, the microphone. I don't know how you'd feel hearing something like that, but for me it hit like a betrayal wrapped in applause, because this wasn't just a lie, it was a theft. He hadn't taken money, he had taken space, the kind of space that Jerome and so many others had bled to earn. That speech, the one people called revolutionary, it was built on a borrowed identity. Not borrowed from history. Borrowed from living people. Jerome knew what it meant to be black on that campus. He knew what it felt like to have your words questioned, your background, doubted, your very existence politicized. He had sat through seminars where professors looked through him. He had been asked, "Are you here on a sports scholarship?" He had felt the sting of polite condescension, the kind that doesn't leave bruises, but leaves dents. And now the man with the microphone, he'd never lived that. But he'd learned to speak it, and speak it well, because when identity becomes currency, the best mimics get rich. There was a moment near the end of Zohran's speech when he raised his voice and declared, "This system has never loved people who look like me." And I swear you could hear the pride swell in that auditorium like a gospel rising. But Jerome didn't clap. He couldn't, because that phrase, "people who look like me," was never meant to be performed. It was meant to be survived. And in that instant, Jerome realized something cruel and clear. Zohran Mamdani didn't steal black pain because he hated it. He stole it because he saw its power. Zohran Mamdani didn't invent the rules. He just learned how to bend them better than most. Back in 2016, he was just another high school senior filling out college applications, stressed, idealistic, sharp as a tack. He knew how the game worked. Not just grades, not just extracurriculars, but narrative. That magical mix of heritage, hardship, and hustle. And when he got to the question race or ethnicity, something in him paused. There it was. Checkboxes. White, Asian, black or African American, Hispanic, Native American. He stared at that form for a long time. Maybe he thought about his mother, an activist from Mumbai educated in London. Maybe he thought about his father, a soft-spoken poet, never political, always watching. Or maybe he didn't think much at all, just saw the box and clicked it. Black? There was no follow-up, no required documentation, no proof. Only a phrase at the bottom, self-identification is voluntary. And just like that, a path opened. His application included an essay about being caught between continents, feeling alien in every room, and wrestling with identity as a child of the diaspora. It was well written, beautiful even, but vague enough to let others fill in the blanks. Admissions officers read it. They saw black. They saw diversity. They saw a story they wanted to believe. And they said yes. When Zohran stepped onto Columbia's campus that fall, no one questioned it. He joined the Black Students' Union, wore a dashiki to cultural night, quoted Baldwin Coates and Audre Lorde with fluent passion. He didn't fake an accent. He didn't dye his skin. He just occupied a role, one that no one dared dispute. Because challenging identity, that's radioactive, and Zohran knew it. He was careful. He never lied outright. He just never corrected anyone. When someone called him Afro-Asian, he nodded. When someone asked about his father's heritage, he deflected. When a professor praised his authentic voice, he humbly said, "It's just my lived experience." But it wasn't. Not in the way people assumed. And here's where it gets personal. Because across the hall from Zohran's dorm was a guy named Jerome Baptiste. Jerome didn't have a viral story. He didn't quote poets. He didn't even know how to apply for a Pell Grant without asking the front desk twice. He was a kid from Port-au-Prince by way of Brooklyn. First in his family to go to college. Worked nights at a bodega just to pay for books Columbia didn't cover. He didn't resent Zohran. In fact, he respected him. They studied together. Debated late into the night. Jerome once helped him rewrite a speech about post-colonial identity and South-South migration. He thought Zohran was brilliant. But there was one moment, small, easy to miss, when things shifted. They were walking back from a panel on racial justice. A girl asked where Zohran was from. He answered mostly East Africa, but it's complicated. Jerome looked at him sideways. East Africa. That was new. But he let it go. Because really, who was he to ask? Who was anyone to ask? That's how this works, doesn't it? In a world obsessed with inclusion, the one crime worse than lying is doubting someone's truth. So Jerome said nothing. Not then. Not when Zohran became a campus favorite. Not when he got picked to lead a task force on anti-racism. Not even when Zohran stood up at graduation and said, "As a black man in America, I carry the burden of histories both inherited and imposed." Jerome just clapped like everyone else, even though his hands felt heavy. Even though his grandmother, the one who used to clean offices in Flatbush, would have called it a performance without sweat. Because that's what hurt most. Not the deception, the ease of it. Jerome had to work for every inch of credibility, had to prove his pain, polish his grammar, perfect his posture, all just to be taken half as seriously. Zohran, he just showed up, said the right words, wore the right language, and the world welcomed him with open arms. Not because he looked like them, but because he looked like what they wanted to believe themselves to be. Inclusive, evolved, post-racial. And that's the tragedy of this story. Not that Zohran cheated the system, but that the system made it so easy to be cheated. For a while, Jerome said nothing. He carried the doubt in his chest like a stone, not heavy enough to break him, but too heavy to ignore. He watched Zohran rise, watched him get invited to speak on panels praised for his cultural empathy, asked to lead student groups Jerome had once helped build, and still he stayed quiet. Because that's what you learn early as a black man in white institutions. Speaking costs more than silence. But silence doesn't mean surrender. It means observation, calculation. And on a cold Wednesday in March, Jerome received a message from someone he hadn't spoken to since high school. Her name was Amira. She was blunt, direct. "Is this your boy?" Attached was a photo from 2014, a group graduation shot. Zohran was in the center, khaki pants, button down, skin visibly lighter than the 3 kids standing next to him. His family stood proudly on either side, his mother in a sari, his father in a Nehru jacket. There was nothing black about it, not culturally, not ethnically, not historically. Jerome stared at the photo, then stared again, and then he went to his drawer and pulled out the freshman orientation booklet. There was Zohran's name, and under ethnicity Black African American. That night, he didn't sleep. He just stared at the ceiling and remembered. He remembered Zohran quoting James Baldwin during an argument about police reform. To be a Negro in this country, and to be relatively conscious, is to be in a rage almost all the time. At the time, it hit hard. Now it sounded like theater. The next day, Jerome walked into the student records office. He didn't shout, didn't accuse. He asked politely for a copy of Zohran's original application as part of a diversity research project he was preparing. The clerk hesitated, but the request wasn't unusual. Within minutes, he had it in hand. He flipped to the page that mattered. There it was, a check mark next to Black Walwaswash African American, and next to it, Raised in East African Asian lineage, experienced systemic injustice across 2 continents. Jerome read that line 5 times, and each time he felt a piece of himself crack. Because that wasn't just a box, it was a door others had banged on for generations with transcripts, essays, sacrifice blood. And Zohran, he'd walked through it wearing someone else's scars. That afternoon, Jerome didn't confront him. He didn't make a scene. He simply started pulling threads. He messaged an old professor, did Zohran ever talk about where he was from? He got a cryptic reply. He once mentioned Zanzibar, but never specifics. He called another classmate from the Black Students' Union. Did you ever meet his family? No, not once. Piece by piece, the picture started shifting. The stories didn't line up. The timelines blurred. The accent changed depending on the room. But what cut deepest wasn't the inconsistency. It was the precision. Zohran hadn't stumbled into this identity. He had crafted it, carefully, deliberately, like a character in a play that only he knew was fiction. Jerome finally confided in his mentor, Professor Lila Edmonds. She listened quietly, didn't interrupt. When he finished, she only said, "Truth always finds the ones who still believe in it." He asked her what he should do. She replied, "You're not here to destroy him. You're here to defend what's real. The rest will take care of itself." And so Jerome wrote a letter, not to the press, not to Twitter, but to the admissions office marked confidential. He attached photos, quotes, application records. No rage, no condemnation. Just facts. And one final sentence. "I'm not asking you to punish him. I'm asking you to protect the ones who never lied." He never got a reply. But 3 weeks later, Zohran's name disappeared from the keynote speaker list, and a new email went out. "In light of recent concerns, we will be reviewing our diversity verification protocols." The story wasn't public, not yet, but the tide was turning, and in the silence that followed, Jerome felt something shift in his chest. Not pride, not vengeance, relief, because the lie wasn't just exposed. It was finally seen. He could have gone public. Jerome had everything screenshots. Photos, the application, record, even a quote from a professor who had doubts. He knew the media would eat it up. One email to the Daily Beast, one post on Twitter, and the mask would be ripped off. But Jerome didn't want a takedown. He wanted clarity. So instead of blasting the truth into headlines, he waited. He waited for the right moment, the human moment. And it came one afternoon in April. He was walking out of Butler Library, arms full of books, when he saw Zohran standing alone in the courtyard, scrolling through his phone like the world couldn't touch him. Jerome walked over. No cameras, no crowd. Just 2 former classmates. And a conversation years overdue. Zohran looked up and smiled. "Jerome, long time." His voice was warm, effortless, trained by years of public speaking. But Jerome didn't return the smile. He set his books down on a bench, then said quietly, "You lied to all of us." There was no accusation in his tone, only fatigue. Zohran blinked. "What? You marked yourself as black. You took the space. You told the story. And the people who actually lived it, we clapped for you." Zohran glanced around as if hoping this was a joke. Then came the line he'd practiced his whole life. "Race is a social construct, man. You of all people know that." But Jerome didn't flinch. He took a breath and said, "And deception is a choice." For a moment there was only wind between them. Zohran put his phone in his pocket. Tried a softer approach. "My family's from East Africa. My great-grandmother." No, Jerome cut in. "Your family's from Mumbai. I've seen the photos." Zohran's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Jerome watched him carefully. "You didn't just lie, Zohran. You choreographed it. You performed it. And the worst part, you did it so well that even people like me, people who know what it's like, started to doubt ourselves." He paused. "You weaponized trust." Zohran stepped back. "I never meant..." "That's the thing," Jerome said. "You didn't have to mean it. You just had to benefit from it." And then he said the line that stayed with Zohran long after the courtyard emptied. "You didn't steal my story. You stole the room it was supposed to be told in." Zohran said nothing. And Jerome, he just picked up his books and walked away. Not triumphant, not angry, just clearer, because the twist wasn't that Zohran lied. The twist was that he believed he had the right to. And Jerome, the one who had every reason to explode, didn't. He chose something rarer. He chose proportion. That night, Zohran stayed quiet on social media. He didn't post his usual quote, didn't drop his usual link. Instead, he texted a journalist friend. "Hey, any chance we could talk off the record about identity politics? I think I made a mistake." But it was too late. Someone had already leaked the photos, the orientation forms, the party clip where Zohran said, "as a black man," with that same rehearsed conviction. And suddenly the comments turned. Not just from trolls, from professors, activists, even his own campaign staff. They weren't angry. They were embarrassed. Because they'd defended him, promoted him, believed him. And now they looked complicit. That's how fast the spell broke. Not with a scandal, with a sigh. The kind people exhale when they realize the person they believed in was just playing a part. The clip hit Twitter at 7:16 p.m. Just 18 seconds long. It showed Zohran standing at a Columbia town hall, passionately declaring, "As a black man in America, I carry the burden of histories both inherited and imposed." That single sentence had once earned him a standing ovation. Now, it was paired with a high school yearbook photo. A photo showing a smiling teen with straight black hair, skin a shade too fair to explain standing between two Indian parents in traditional Diwali clothes. No caption was needed. The internet filled in the rest. Within 90 minutes, the post hit 400,000 views. By morning, it had crossed 2 million. The hashtags told the story before any article could. #ethnic fraud, #checked, the wrong box, #woke privilege. But this wasn't just a Twitter mob. It was an unraveling. Because as more people looked closer, more contradictions emerged. Old classmates came forward. One remembered Zohran refusing to attend Black student union meetings in high school. Another recalled him correcting someone for mispronouncing his Indian surname, not African, not Caribbean. A journalist at the Columbia Spectator published a timeline matching Zohran's public statements to his actual records. It didn't scream fraud, it whispered performance. And that was somehow worse, because fraud is desperate. Performance is strategic. It wasn't about identity, it was about utility. The college had quietly removed his name from their speaker series. A student senator proposed a vote to revoke his diversity grant. No official statement, no disciplinary board, just distance. Everyone wanted distance. Professors who once quoted him in lectures now changed the subject. Campus groups deleted their photos with him. A progressive newsletter scrubbed his op-eds. He didn't disappear. He was edited. Jerome watched it all unfold quietly. No victory lap. No, I told you so. Instead, he got a message from a freshman named Alana. Black, first gen, bright-eyed, undeclared major. It said, "Thank you. I thought I was crazy for not feeling seen. Turns out I just wasn't being seen by someone real." He stared at the message for a long time, then wrote back, "You deserve a voice that didn't borrow someone else's pain to be heard." That's what it came down to. Not race, not identity, but truth, and the right to speak without someone rehearsing your story for applause. Meanwhile, Zohran posted a statement. Not on Twitter, on Medium. It was 200 words long, titled "A Complicated Heritage, a Painful Misstep." It began, "I've never felt I belonged to one category. My upbringing was global, my experience intersectional. I now realize that in trying to express complexity, I caused harm." The tone was apologetic, measured, PR polished, but it missed something vital. It never said I lied. Not once. It danced around the edges. Jerome read it and closed his laptop, because that's the part people forget. You don't always need punishment. You need acknowledgement, and Zohran couldn't offer that. Not because he wasn't sorry, but because if he admitted the truth, he'd have to give back everything the lie built, and some people can't do that. Not after tasting power, not after being praised as the face of progress. So instead he faded. Slowly, event invitations dried up, donations stopped, endorsements went silent. He still posted occasionally links to articles about colonialism, race theory, global struggle, but the comments weren't forgiving. They were clinical, dissecting every word, highlighting every echo of performance. Not because people hated him, because they no longer trusted him. That's the difference. Hate can be healed. Distrust stains. And as Zohran sat in his apartment that summer, scrolling through feeds he used to dominate, what haunted him wasn't the exposure. It was the vacuum. The room that had once cheered him. Now it didn't boo. It just didn't answer. The campus auditorium was packed. Not for a protest. Not for Zohran. This was something new. A panel titled, "Who Gets to Claim Struggle?" 4 students, 2 professors, and 1 moderator. No headlines, no hashtags. Just a hard conversation held face to face. The organizers invited Jerome Baptiste. At first he declined. "I'm not interested in becoming the mascot for fraud detection," he told them. But they pressed not for outrage, but for honesty. So he agreed. The night of the event he wore no suit. No prepared remarks. Just a gray hoodie with frayed cuffs and the weight of lived truth. He sat quietly as others spoke. A girl from Trinidad shared how her father's accent cost him 3 job interviews. A Latino boy explained how checking other on the census form made him feel invisible. Then it was Jerome's turn. He stood. No mic. Just a voice trained by silence. "I'm not here to talk about Zohran," he began. "I'm here to talk about the difference between story and structure." A pause. "I don't care if you traveled through 5 continents or 5 boroughs. I care whether you walked through the door carrying your story or whether you borrowed someone else's to unlock it." The room went still. I'm tired of seeing people audition for pain they didn't earn. A few people nodded. One girl covered her mouth, not in shock, but recognition. "My grandmother cleaned floors in Flatbush for 20 years, he said. "She never filled out a form that said black. She just was. And every day she reminded me, don't let them decorate themselves in your struggle like it's a damn Halloween costume." The crowd broke into murmurs. Jerome continued. "I'm not asking for blood tests or background checks. I'm asking for integrity. Because the moment we stop defending the difference between lived experience and performance, we lose everything we've fought for." Then came the quiet line that landed hardest of all. "Identity is not a metaphor. It's a receipt." When he sat down, there was no applause. Only breath. Held, measured, heavy. Because that's what truth does. It doesn't entertain. It arrests. Later that night, Jerome stepped outside for air. He found himself standing next to Professor Lila Edmonds. She said nothing at first. Then finally, that line about identity being a receipt, I'm going to borrow that. He laughed. "Just don't wear it like a name tag." They both smiled, and that was the difference. The people in that room didn't want a villain. They wanted standards. Meanwhile, across campus, Zohran sat in a study lounge refreshing his email. Nothing. His inbox, once filled with invites, was now a series of auto-replies and polite declines. The Columbia Equity Council, the same group that once made him its poster child, had removed him from the speakers page. A memo went out internally. Moving forward, all ethnic self-identification used for representation must include corroborating context. It didn't mention him by name, but everyone knew. The system didn't burn him. It quietly unplugged him. And for someone who built a platform on being amplified, the silence was deafening. But this story wasn't just his anymore. The damage rippled. Students who had followed him now questioned themselves. Others who had played with the lines of identity now pulled back, afraid. And for black students like Alana, the freshman who once looked up to him, the betrayal lingered like smoke after a fire. She wrote an op-ed, titled, "When Representation Becomes Performance." In it, she asked, "How do you fight for your voice when someone else is lip-syncing your life?" It went viral. Not angry, not accusatory, just raw. Measured, real. Jerome read it twice, then emailed her. "You didn't just write a piece. You reclaimed the room." She replied in one line. "So did you." News travels fast in spaces that pretend to move slow. By the following week, the fallout had moved beyond Columbia. An op-ed appeared in The Atlantic. Headline, "Progressivism Can't Survive Performance." It didn't name Zohran. It didn't need to. It was a scalpel disguised as a mirror. Written by Dr. Lorraine Matthews, a tenured sociologist who had once cited Zohran's speeches in her own work. Now she was retracting them. not out of bitterness, out of regret. Her piece opened with a question. What happens when the face of struggle never had to survive it? She wrote of her own father denied tenure for being too assertive, of her sister rejected from a fellowship that Zohran later received. And she ended with this: if we are too afraid to question identity, then we are not empowering the marginalized, we are entertaining the ambitious. It hit like a sermon, the kind that burns quietly and leaves ashes in your chest. That week, Columbia's Board of Diversity Affairs called an emergency meeting. No press, no minutes released. But one member leaked a sentence from the internal memo. If trust is our currency, then unchecked identity claims are our inflation. Behind the scenes, policies began shifting. New forms required optional context fields, space to explain heritage, cultural roots, and community connection. A professor who had once introduced Zohran at a symposium posted a one-line tweet: "We owe more than belief. We owe discernment." Meanwhile, back on campus, Jerome received a visit from Dean Hayes. They met in a quiet office. No formal setting. Just 2 chairs and a carafe of cold water between them. Dean Hayes leaned forward. "I read your letter again, twice." Jerome stayed silent. The dean continued. "Most people would have gone public." "You didn't," Jerome replied. "Public doesn't always fix what's broken. Sometimes it just breaks it louder." The dean smiled, not a happy smile, a tired one. "We've begun reviewing our representation protocols. Not because of media pressure, because you reminded us what we forgot." Jerome tilted his head. "And what's that?" The dean answered. "That sometimes truth doesn't shout. It just waits for someone to finally listen." Outside spring was bleeding into summer. Students were packing up dorms, seniors posing for photos, hashtags shifting to new causes. But one thing hadn't faded: the absence of Zohran Mamdani. He hadn't been expelled. He hadn't made any official announcement. He just receded. Word had it he'd transferred his credits to another program out of state. No send-off, no goodbye. Just a vanished presence where a manufactured persona had once lived. Alana, the freshman who'd penned the viral op-ed, gave the closing speech at the year's final student forum. She didn't mention Zohran either. Instead, she told a story about her grandmother, a jazz pianist in Chicago who never recorded a single song. She said the microphone scared her, Alana said, because once the world hears your voice, they try to own it. She paused. "I didn't understand that until this year." The room was hushed. Then she added, "From now on, I won't hand my story to someone just because they speak louder. I'll wait for someone who listens better." Afterward, Jerome approached her. "You killed that," he said. She laughed. "Not bad for a girl from Bronzeville, right?" He nodded, then asked gently, "Do you ever think he meant well?" She didn't answer right away. Then finally, "I think he meant to be seen." And somewhere along the way, he forgot the difference between empathy and impersonation. It wasn't bitter, it wasn't forgiving. It was truth. And truth, when spoken without armor, lands deeper than any expose. It had been 3 weeks since the panel, 2 since the memo, and 5 since Zohran's name disappeared from every university roster. No formal charges, no viral confession, just a name slowly erased by institutional discomfort. But stories don't vanish when names do. They settle, they simmer, and sometimes they return when no one's looking. One evening, Jerome walked through Hamilton Hall, headed for a late-night tutoring session with underclassmen. He stopped near the back staircase. A flicker of movement caught his eye. There, slouched behind a support beam hoodie pulled over his head, sat Zohran. Not speaking, not scrolling, just sitting in stillness. Their eyes met. No one moved. Finally, Jerome broke the silence. "You still hiding?" Zohran didn't flinch. "No, just waiting for the noise to die." Jerome stepped forward. "It's already dead. That's the part you never understood." Zohran looked up, tired. "You think I didn't care?" Jerome shook his head slowly. "I think you cared more about being heard than being honest." Zohran leaned back, voice barely above a whisper. "You ever want something so badly, you become what people expect just so they'll let you in." Jerome paused, then sat beside him. "Not out of forgiveness, out of recognition." "Yeah," he said, "but I never forgot who I was to get there." They sat in silence. No speeches, no resolution, just two young men with miles behind their eyes. After a moment, Zohran spoke again. I thought if I could just say it well enough, I could live it. Jerome looked straight ahead. That's not how identity works. Zohran turned. How does it work? Jerome answered. It's what's left after the applause dies. The next day, Zohran packed his things. No farewell photos, no parting words, just a quiet exit down College Walk with one duffel bag and 1,000 unspoken apologies folded into its seams. He didn't vanish completely. Later, a small post appeared on a personal blog. No byline, just a title. I took a story that wasn't mine. In it, the author didn't explain, didn't defend, just described the feeling of being invisible in all the wrong ways. One sentence stood out. I confused representation with redemption, and in trying to fix the world, I broke something I never had the right to hold. It didn't go viral, but it reached who it needed to. Jerome read it in the library one night. He didn't forward it, didn't screenshot it. He closed the tab, leaned back, and whispered. Finally, that spring, Columbia held its annual recognition ceremony. It was smaller this year, more intimate. No celebrities, no TikTok stars. Just names, faces, families, and voices, real ones, trembling with memory. Jerome was invited to give closing remarks. He didn't plan a speech. He stood on the small stage, hands tucked in his pockets, and said, I came here thinking success meant being seen. A beat. But this year taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is help others be seen without ever stepping in front of them. He scanned the crowd. Your story isn't a ladder, it's a lamp. You carry it for others. Not to rise, but to light the way. There was no thunder of applause, just quiet, head-bowed nods. And somewhere in the back row, Alana clutched her grandmother's old locket and mouthed the words, We see you. That night, Jerome walked across campus for the last time as a student. The wind was soft, the future unclear, but his truth unshaken. Because he didn't win, he witnessed, and that in the end made all the difference. The weeks after graduation weren't glamorous. No interviews, no viral threads, no email from the New York Times. Jerome moved into a shared apartment in Harlem with two friends. He got a part-time job at a community center tutoring kids whose names no one wrote on university plaques. And quietly, without fanfare, he became someone people trusted. Not because he spoke loud, but because he didn't have to. Alana visited one afternoon. She brought coffee and a half-joking smile. You're becoming a neighborhood myth, she teased. Jerome laughed. I'm just trying to keep the lights on in my wallet and in other people's heads. They sat on the stoop watching kids run by with popsicles and loud sneakers. Then she turned serious. You could have dragged him. Publicly. You didn't. Why? Jerome thought for a moment. Then said, because the lie wasn't just his. It was in all of us, in how we crave stories louder than we crave truth. Alana nodded slowly. He wrote a blog post. I know. You believe him. Jerome shrugged. Doesn't matter if I do. What matters is whether he believes it enough not to repeat it. Alana leaned back against the railing. My grandma used to say we forgive not to free them, but to free space inside ourselves. Jerome smiled. Sounds like someone I would have liked. She was a trip. Played piano like the keys owed her money. They laughed. It wasn't just small talk. It was healing. Because pain, when shared without performance, becomes something more than trauma. It becomes a foundation. That weekend, Jerome started mentoring first-year students of color. Not with rules, with stories. He told them about his mistakes, about silence, about how even the smartest people get fooled when a message sounds right but comes from the wrong mouth. He didn't name Zohran. He didn't have to. Because the real lesson wasn't about exposure. It was about ownership. One student, Malik, pulled him aside after a session. He was nervous, hesitant. I got a cousin Malik said mixed race but light-skinned like me. He never feels black enough. Always overcompensating. Tries too hard. Jerome nodded. I've been there. What do I tell him? Jerome looked him in the eye. Tell him we don't need him to prove anything. Just to listen first, then speak. Malik exhaled. You should be a professor. Jerome laughed. I'd fail tenure for being too honest. That night he stayed up writing not for an audience, just for himself, a private journal entry. I've learned that truth is quieter than performance, slower than narrative, and lonelier than applause. But it endures, and that makes it worth carrying. He folded the paper, slid it into a shoebox with graduation photos, newspaper clippings, and a worn copy of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. Not as a shrine, as a reminder. That identity isn't built in panels or speeches. It's built in private moments no one will ever post about. Moments where you choose silence over spectacle, listening over leverage, integrity over influence. The world didn't know Jerome's name, but the people who mattered, they knew, and that he realized was the kind of legacy no lie could imitate. Months passed. Autumn crept in quietly, brushing Harlem with wind that carried both chill and clarity. Jerome's life looked simple now, tutoring reading community forums. But beneath that simplicity was something sharper, conviction earned through restraint. He no longer needed to talk about Zohran. People had made their judgments. What lingered instead was a broader reckoning, a new awareness, especially among those who once chased representation like a metric. Suddenly, institutions wanted context, not just color. A major literary journal updated its author submission forms, now asking not just how someone identifies, but why that identity shapes the work. An elite foundation quietly revised their diversity scholarship, now requiring applicants to share not only heritage, but cultural community engagement. And across online spaces once ruled by performative outrage, a new phrase began surfacing. Lived experience isn't a costume. Jerome noticed. He noticed the shift in tone at workshops, the questions that went deeper, the hesitation before someone spoke on behalf of a group they didn't belong to. It wasn't about fear. It was about respect. One Saturday, he was invited to speak on a podcast hosted by a former classmate. The theme was Truth in the Age of Narrative. They chatted about college activism and the thin line between influence and impersonation. Then came the final question. If you could say one thing to young leaders who want to speak up for justice, what would it be? Jerome didn't pause. He leaned in and said, "Start by making sure the mic in your hand was meant for your voice, not someone else's echo." The host went silent for a moment, then softly said amen. The clip was shared widely, not because it was shocking, because it felt like relief. Finally, someone had named the discomfort, the unease so many felt watching movements get co-opted by charisma. And Jerome? He kept showing up, not as a firebrand, not as a symbol, as a human being who had seen the cost of pretending and chose something better. He still thought about Zohran sometimes, not with anger, with curiosity. Where did he go? Did he start over? Did he tell the truth even once in a room that didn't reward it? Maybe. Or maybe the world simply absorbed him as it often does, with clever men who fail upwards until the mirror cracks. But it didn't matter, because this wasn't his story anymore. It belonged to those who showed up after, the students who no longer apologized for being too quietly black, the girls who didn't straighten their hair for interviews, the first gens who checked the other box and added, "Ask me." I'll explain. They were the ones who mattered now. Jerome passed them every day on buses, in bookstores, at community dinners, and he saw something in their posture. Not pride, ownership, that subtle difference between demanding to be seen and standing tall enough that no one could look past them. One night, as he was locking up the tutoring center, a young boy ran back in. "Mr. J, wait." Jerome turned. The kid held out a wrinkled worksheet. "I forgot this." Jerome smiled. "Thanks, man." The boy lingered, then asked, "Hey, you always talk like you know stuff. Like not from books, but from feeling. Did you ever lie to get in somewhere?" Jerome looked at him, really looked, then knelt down to eye level. "No, but I almost let someone else's lie go unchecked." The boy blinked. "Why didn't you?" Jerome smiled. "Because someday you'll be here, and I wanted the room to still be honest when you walked in. Some stories don't go viral. They don't end in courtrooms or rallies. They don't get turned into documentaries or bestsellers. Some stories just sit quietly, uncomfortably in the rooms we thought we understood. This was one of them, a story where no one died. No laws were broken. No headlines screamed. And yet, Something was lost. Trust. Trust in institutions that said they valued voices but didn't ask if those voices were real. Trust in the power of lived experience, diluted by someone who rehearsed it like a monologue. Trust in progress not because it failed, but because it was too easy to fake. But trust isn't built by slogans. It's built by boundaries. By saying, yes, you're welcome here. And also, but don't come wearing someone else's skin. This isn't about gatekeeping. It's about gate fixing. Because when the door swings open for performance over truth, real stories get pushed to the back of the room. Jerome knew that. He felt it in every applause. Zohran received applause that should have gone to someone who had bled for that story. And here's the part you can't tweet. Jerome never wanted fame. He never wanted revenge. He just wanted to make sure that when the next Alana stood up, her mic was real. So what about you? You watching this now? You who believes in equity, who reposts infographics, who donates sign supports. Ask yourself, when was the last time you questioned the storyteller? Not to discredit, but to protect the people whose stories we say we care about. And if you're the storyteller, ask, is this mine to tell? Because if it isn't, then telling it doesn't make you brave. It makes you louder than someone who spent a lifetime trying to be heard. And they deserve the mic more than you deserve the moment. So remember Zohran Mamdani, not to hate him, but to notice him in every voice that sounds just a little too polished, every pain that feels just a little too rehearsed. And remember Jerome, not because he exposed the lie, but because he believed truth was enough. Share this story, not for outrage, for calibration. Because if we don't draw the line, we let the story be written by people who never had to live it.